just from a practical perspective, writing legal thrillers from the prosecutor's perspective is really difficult. If you think about most legal thrillers, they're usually from the defense side because you can get off the innocent client. Right. Whereas you're prosecuting someone and you're the narrator, you're the protagonist, the slash hero, whatever. I mean, if you don't get the right guy, then you're kind of a dope.
Hello and welcome to See You in Court, the podcast that informs you about the Georgia civil justice system, what it means to you, and how it protects individual rights. This podcast is a collaboration between the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation and the Georgia Institute of Technology. Your hosts are Robin Fraser Clark and Lester Tate, who are both past presidents of the State Bar of Georgia and currently serve on the board of directors of the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation. And now this episode of See You in Court.
Good morning, friends and lovers of the law, and welcome to See You in Court. I am Robin Fraser Clark, and with me, as usual, is my lovable co-host, Lester Tate. Lester, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. And the listeners should know my co-host has gone to Hollywood now with the Georgia Bulldogs to pull them through. And being a tech guy, I'm sadly left at home today, but I do wish the dogs well in their endeavor to repeat tonight.
Yeah, we're excited to be here in Southern California. I'm taping this from downtown Los Angeles right now. We'll be going to the game later this afternoon. And it is cold and rainy in Southern California.
Well, isn't there a song about that? It never rains in Southern California or something.
The song is wrong. It's cold and wet here.
But you got an indoor feel for tonight, so it shouldn't change the game. Have you got a prediction for tonight's game?
No, I'm too superstitious to do stuff like that.
See, being a tech guy, I'm always glad to opine, on Georgia football. But my prediction is, and I don't mean to jinx them in any way, but my prediction is I think it's just have a superior team to TCU as long as they don't start fumbling and throwing interceptions and getting penalties, which has been something that Georgia's been great about not doing. All year long. They may play down to their opponent's level a little bit, but they don't make those stupid mistakes. And of course, in the Ohio State game, I think they had one interception, and it's one of the things that made it a lot closer. So,
right,
barring a bunch of turnovers and penalties, I'm predicting the Dogs win.
Well, from your mouth to God's ears, let's hope. And we're pulling for the Dogs, and go Dogs. But I'm delighted to be able to tape this with you while I'm here and you're back in Georgia, because we have an incredible guest with us today, Lance McMillian. We're delighted to have him. Let me tell you a little bit about Lance. He's a law professor and an author, and has authored several legal thrillers we're going to talk about. So we're going to be looking forward to diving into those books and Lance's reason for writing. Let me tell you a little bit more about his background. Lance obtained his Bachelor of Arts from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Phi Beta Kappa, and his Juris Doctor from University of Georgia School of Law, summa cum laude, and Order of the Coif. He is a full-time professor of law at Atlanta's John Marshall School of Law, where he teaches torts, constitutional law, federal courts, constitutional law seminar, First Amendment seminar, white-collar crime, domestic relations, depositions, law office management, remedies in context, and scholarly writing. Professor McMillian joined the Atlanta's John Marshall faculty in 2007. Before embarking on a teaching and writing career, Professor McMillian wore many different hats in the legal profession, including those of civil litigator, commercial arbitrator, and certified mediator. The focus of his practice centered primarily on complex litigation, class action prosecution and defense, business torts, constitutional torts, and discrimination. In 2002, he became a founding partner of the law firm of McMillian and Camp, LLP. Following its inception, the firm was approved as lead counsel by numerous federal and state courts in class and collective actions arising under the Telephone Consumer Protection Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. In this role, Professor McMillian successfully negotiated several 6- and 7-figure settlements. As a neutral, Professor McMillian mediated and arbitrated over 100 active lawsuits. Professor McMillian's writing career is just as diverse. He is a novelist and creator of the Atlanta Murder Squad series. The first book in the series, The Murder of Sarah Barton, won a prestigious Bragg, B-R-A-G, medallion and became the #1 bestseller legal thriller on Amazon. His nonfiction work has appeared in such legal journals as the North Carolina Law Review, the Washington and Lee Law Review, the Wisconsin Law Review, the Alabama Law Review, the Tennessee Law Review, the Southern Cal Interdisciplinary Law Journal, and the American Journal of Trial Advocacy. He also contributed a chapter for Lawyers in Your Living Room, Law on Television, a book project from the American Bar Association, and that also featured essays from actors Sam Watterson and James Woods. A number of federal and state courts, including an opinion by Judge Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, have cited Professor McMillian in their opinions. Professor McMillian is married to Justice Carla Wong McMillian of the Georgia Supreme Court. A little bit about Atlanta's John Marshall Law School, where Lance is a professor. It is a private, nonprofit law school in Atlanta, Georgia. It was founded in 1933 and named for John Marshall, the 4th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Atlanta's John Marshall Law School is accredited by the American Bar Association. It was among the first Southern law schools to integrate. It is in Midtown Atlanta and is accredited by the American Bar Association. It offers 5 JD programs: full-time day, part-time evening, accelerated spring start, and a criminal justice certificate program led by MacArthur Genius Fellow Jonathan Rapping. Lance's books that we're going to be talking about a little bit more are To Kill a Lawyer, 2021, Death to the Chief, The Murder of Sarah Barton, and his latest novel is A Hard Way to Die, the 4th in the Atlanta Murder Squad series, and takes place at a Georgia State Bar annual meeting on Jekyll Island. Lester, we've been to a few.
I think that's the one. Is it, Professor? Isn't that the one where you kill off a state bar president?
It is, yes.
Lance, welcome to the show. I just couldn't pass up talking about Jekyll Island and all the state bar annual meetings we've attended.
I see these people on Twitter that say, I feel attacked. I feel murdered with this, but it is, and I've been reading the Murder of Sarah Barton, and it's so great to read all these places that like Robin in Los Angeles. I mean, I grew up watching Dragnet and Adam 12, and they were all over, the city of Los Angeles is sort of a character, and the city of Atlanta and the state of Georgia are sort of characters in your books, I think.
I was born in Fulton County, so I'm, writing about what I know.
That's the first lesson in writing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Write about what you know. Well, yeah. Lance, we're delighted to have you here. You've got a remarkable career. I wanted to talk first before we get into your writing process and why you decided to start writing fiction novels. Let's talk a little bit about your teaching at your job as a full professor at John Marshall Law School. That's first of all, it's neat. I love that, but it's also full time. I mean, I just read all the classes you teach. I think you must teach every class given at John Marshall. Tell us a little bit about that. How many students you have, and how many classes you're teaching this semester, and why you like it.
Yeah, I love it. It is a great job. I think it's the best job in the legal profession because you get to think about the law, study the law, talk about the law, and do so in a way that's interesting, that gives you a lot of freedom to explore your interests. I forgot I taught some of those classes too. 15 years. But my two favorite classes, the ones I've taught the vast majority of time, are torts and constitutional law. And torts is my favorite by far. Just the facts, you can't invent the facts you see in some of these tort cases. So it's a fun class to teach, and it's a first year class, and it's nice to get the students, while they're fresh. I come in the first day of law school with them, don't even introduce myself. I just call a student right off the bat nicely, and they don't know what hit them. But they're engaged.
I remember those days.
Yeah, they're engaged.
4 years ago.
I think it's more of a shock for them than for us, because I don't know they get that same thing in undergrad. I know they don't. So it's kind of a different educational world they grew up in. But it's a privilege to kind of shape the next generation of lawyers, and especially at our school. I mean, we're very egalitarian. We call ourselves an opportunity law school. There's a lot of first generation lawyers, which I appreciate, because I was a first generation college student. And just to be able to democratize the profession in that way, to give chances to students who have big dreams, but other schools don't want to give them a chance. It's an honor, and I love it.
I'm always interested in unusual legal credentials, mainly because one of my unusual legal credentials is I'm the only lawyer I know that made a law review, but never made an A in law school. And I have a standing bet, if anybody can find somebody else with that, I'll buy them dinner and a bottle of wine at any restaurant in Atlanta they want. I've never had to pay. But you have a very, I think, unusual credential that, in my mind at least, gives you a huge competitive advantage in teaching people about the law. Typically law professors, graduate at the top of their class, they go clerk for federal judges, and then they go to some big firm where they're an associate for 3 or 4 years, and that's their experience in private practice. You may be the only law professor I've ever met who was the founder of a law firm, and had your own law firm. And I'd be interested to hear how that maybe informs your teaching of the law in a way that's maybe different from folks who've only been in big firms, which is, like I said, more the norm, for law professors.
Yeah, I think that's true. Not that I'm the only one, but it's true of our school in general, to brag on our faculty a little bit. There's no doubt in my mind, it's unofficial, but we have more combined trial experience than all the rest of the law schools in Georgia combined. Probably just Mike Mears himself. Mike Mears probably has 300 trials. He's a legend in the Georgia legal community. He probably had his own firm at some point during his career. But I mean, John Rapping has a ton of trials. We have a lot of criminal defense, public defenders who did that work. That's kind of what we look for in a faculty is practical experience. Whereas a lot of law schools, the more you practice, they take that as a sign that you're not serious about scholarship, and it's almost a black mark that you practice too long. So it's not just me at John Marshall. I mean, it's the whole faculty, and it does matter, especially with our student body, who's more likely. The doors of big law, probably not going to be open to them. Certainly coming out, there's some who gravitate towards that way after they've been practicing a while. But a lot of our students are going back to small town communities. They're going to form their own practice. And so, I try to incorporate some stories about that, into my teaching, because that's some of the issues they're going to have to face, when they're out there. And so it definitely does, make a difference. I think in how I try to reach these students who might be on the same path that I was on once upon a time.
Yeah, I saw that one of your classes was called Law Office Management. Well, I went to Emory Law School. They wouldn't even consider something like that. No practical knowledge given to us at Emory whatsoever. It was all academic and theoretical. And but I love that you offer that, and it comes from a personal basis. You have personal knowledge, but also you're really trying to help these young students. Here's what you need to know to meet a payroll, how to deal with a client who's a real live walking person sitting across the table from you. You know, that's one of our standards Lester and I have is if you're a real lawyer, you've actually had a person with a problem who's a live human being sit across your table from you and tell you about their issues. So I love that you have offered that type of class there too.
Yeah, that was earlier on in my career when I was closer to it. And it was very nuts and bolts and practical. And this is what you have to do. And the materials I used were the same materials that I had used, when I did it, years before. And so I wanted to, make that as, close to the reality as I could. Now, I think now we have practitioners who have their own firm these days doing it. Because one of the things that changed since I had my firm was the software.
Yeah.
And I kind of was before that kind of changed that whole dynamic. So I'm a little behind these days on that. But
yeah, I will tell you too, the proof's always in the pudding. And I had a law clerk that was one of your students and who, after she passed the bar, briefly worked for me. She found a job closer to home. And in addition to really loving you and saying you were her favorite professor, just excelled at helping me deal with clients. And so it was Beth Johnston is her name. And it was just really good at that. And having seen other lawyers that had gone to perhaps more, I don't want to use the word prestigious because I'm not convinced the U.S. News and World Report rankings convey prestige. But, having gone to some of these other law schools that are more focused on big law, clerkships and that type thing, I think you really do put out the product that you say you're going to put out.
Well, that's great to hear. And, Beth's wonderful. And that's what I tell the students. Their whole life, they've been playing this academic game that measures a very small set of skills. But once you're a lawyer, there's a whole other, basket or baskets of skills that go into being successful. And I tell them you don't have to play the academic game anymore. And if you're willing to work hard and you have grit, these other skills that you have, can make you a very successful lawyer.
Yeah. Are you teaching con law this semester?
Yes.
I'm thinking that might be an interesting semester in con law.
Yeah, it's a full year class, but this is the semester that we get into the changes from last summer, and we'll see how that goes. I've taught con law a long time too, mm-hmm. and I don't like it as much as torts. The facts aren't as interesting. It can be dry sometimes. The market participant exceptions, the dormant commerce clause, being an example. But it changes all the time, and it. That can create some cynicism.
Indeed, especially over our United States Supreme Court.
And it's a hard, it's a hard, constitutional interpretation is just hard. And you can read a majority and say, oh, that sounds right. And it's 5-4. And the dissent's making good points too. And you have these issues that turn on these very narrow things. By the end of the day, we all know it depends who's sitting in the seat that the results you're going to get, even though the reasoning, you can make good arguments both for and against the reasoning, but it just matters who's in the chair.
The best advice I ever got about when I started law school, had a friend who actually went to Yale Law School. He'd gone his first year before I started. And he said, if you ever get stumped on a con law question, just use a balancing test. And I thought that was about the best advice I ever got.
Yeah.
That's good. And then I was going to ask you about torts, which is your favorite. I know you cover, especially for first years, the classic cases like Penoyer v. Neff, I guess, and International Shoe, those kind of things. But do you ever take fact patterns from cases that you're reading about in the daily report, things going on in Georgia? Do you ever use those cases to teach your students?
Sometimes. More probably as hypotheticals as opposed to, studying, the opinion. But yeah, that's the thing about being a professor, that there's always material, floating about that, even if I'm not planning on it, a question can come up in the context of the dialogue in the class. And then it, I remember that, case and throw it back at the student, and see what happens.
Have you ever used any of Justice Long McMillian's opinions, taught any of those or critiqued those in your class?
Well, not critiqued, but yes, some of them. Or at least there was I don't know if she wrote it or she's on the panel. It was a Facebook social media type thing about parental liability for the post of their teenager, and leaving it up and responsibility like that. And so I know I've talked about that in the context of my First Amendment seminar class, at least, once. So
that's neat. Well, let's talk a little bit about your other career that you have going on simultaneously, another full-time job, it seems like, and that's writing legal fiction. Lester and I love to read, and that's one thing, that's kind of a neat thing about being a lawyer. You read all day in your job, and then you go home, you like to read more. But we both love to read, and we love to talk to authors. So I couldn't wait to talk to you about this. Why did you decide to go into writing fiction?
It's just, I think it's something I always wanted to do. I read Presumed Innocent when I was a senior in high school.
Yeah.
When I was a freshman in college, I read The Firm, then, A Time to Kill, then everything when Grisham came out with a new book. And I just had the idea, at some point I would like to do that. And, tinkered with certain ideas over years, never really, got far with it. And then once I got tenure, it gave me a little more, flexibility in terms of, what I wrote, and I just sat down and, try to come up with a book. Now it was a lot harder than what that sounds like, because this took years off and on. I don't even know how long it took. It may have been 5, 6, 7 years. I really don't know. And, I have it get stuck, ignore it, go back. And then eventually, I pressed through and got a draft done, and kind of been off to the races since then.
Yeah, that's so cool. Do you start with an outline, or you just start writing?
Well, I didn't for the first book, and that was a mistake. That's why it took maybe 6 and 7 years. I had ideas in my head, and because these are kind of mystery type books too, what I learned from the first book was I don't have to have an outline of everything, but I got to know the clues that I'm going to use to, eventually solve the mystery. And I didn't have that with the first book as I was writing it. And that was the roadblock I kept coming, back to again and again. And I had to go back and, reinvent that as I wrote. And one of the things when I wrote that book, it was just, I was of the school, you write when you're inspired, which is not the right school. And so I would start like, hey, this is in chapter 1. And I think, well, I got this good idea for 3/4 of the way down in the book. So I wrote that. It was not linear at all over the place, which was another problem. Indeed, the very last paragraph that I wrote that completed the first draft was stuck kind of near the end, but not in the last few pages. Just to kind of show that it was just very sporadic. But I mean, that was like the moment, like I finished a draft. And it was actually, I think it's the best paragraph I've ever written up to that point and actually since. But it wasn't the last paragraph of the book. It was, a little before that, just stuck somewhere because I was just plugging holes. Learned my lesson, and much more linear with the books 2 through 4, and knowing the clues. Like, I will not start until I know how I'm going to solve the puzzle. And I can fill the other gaps fine, writing, but I got to know the solution. And everything hinges on that. Once I have the solution, I can start.
So, I'm a Grisham fan too. I think I'd read A Time to Kill right before I went out, left big law to go hang a shingle in Cartersville, Georgia, so I felt like I actually learned something, from A Time to Kill. But I know Grisham said, he'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and he'd write so long each day. Stephen Pressfield, who is not a legal thriller author, but writes a lot of historical fiction, wrote a book. I think the name of it is The War of Art. And one of his sayings is, put your ass where your heart wants to be, basically saying, sit down and, spend time on it every day instead of waiting for inspiration. So do you now have some system that you go about, or some dedicated time each day, week, month that you write, or is it still sort of waiting for the muse to come?
It's not waiting for the muse, but I don't have a set process. And the Pressfield book, The War of Art, I encourage all my students to read it, because it's bigger than just about writing a book. It's about being a professional and doing the work and holding yourself responsible, to the work. And it's a short book. It's a great book. I read it once a year, and at the end of every semester, I recommend books to my students, and that's one of them. And the students that have read it, love it, because it's about becoming pro. My problem is, I don't have to necessarily be a professional novelist because I have the other job. And so getting started on a book is the hard part. Like the first 20,000 words, it really is a struggle to get me going. And I don't write a set time every day, that because I just haven't got to that point yet where I can discipline myself, to do that. But I mean, that's, Stephen King's amazing. His output is amazing because that's what he does every day. It's like 9 to 1 every morning, same place, same time, does the work. So I'm much more hit or miss. Now, once I get started, like now I'm on book 5, and I try at a minimum trying to write 1,000 words a day. And I got 5 straight days of this. I got a streak going, but you got the national championship game today.
Right.
I had trouble sleeping last night, so I'm probably going to take a nap sometime this afternoon. And classes start tomorrow, so I got to prepare a little bit for that. Now I've already written 200 words, but I got another 800 I got to crank in somewhere. But there's always time. And that's the Grisham thing. He got up 5:30 every day. I mean, I waste a ton of time just on the internet, whatever. It's why I didn't really work, like working in big law for my first couple of years, just because just the 6-minute increments, didn't. It's not how my mind worked. I'm much more undisciplined than that.
You're preaching to the choir here.
Yeah, we don't like to bill hours either. That's why we do what we do.
I'm also curious.
I always said that billing hours suck the joy out of practicing law. So I stopped it. I don't bill.
Absolutely. So, I've read different people, like Grisham, I think, if I remember correctly, took a steno pad with him to court and would write, while enduring a calendar call. I remember reading that Shelby Foote, when he wrote the Civil War trilogy, wrote with a fountain pen, and wrote like a page each day and hand corrected everything. I've read that Ace Atkins, who has written a bunch of mystery novels, pecks them out on a typewriter. He was a reporter at one time. How do you physically write your books?
I try to do them now on a laptop because that saves a lot of time. But when I'm stuck, I found that handwriting can get me unstuck quicker than just working on the laptop. For part of it, when I'm on the laptop, one thing I have to do to be more disciplined, I got to turn the wireless off. Because when I'm on the laptop, there's just kind of this instinctual thing, I got to check something, and it's a time thief. But I try to do it now on laptop. The first book a lot of it was handwritten. And that created longer time because then I got it, type it up. And that means you're correcting as you go, which is not probably best practices. You want to finish the first draft as soon as possible, then circle back and correct. But it's a lot easier trying to type it. But
you shared a short article that you had written called How I Write. You shared that with us, and I hope I'll be able to share that with our listeners. This article was published in Scribe's Journal of Law Writing. I really enjoyed reading it, Lance, but I wanted to share the first paragraph of this article about what you described, the condition of not writing. I thought that was very clever. And you say not writing, the condition of using any pretext as a justification for the avoidance of putting words on the blank page, is the unrelenting scourge of my life as a novelist. Its allies are legion: the wife, the kids, my day job as a law professor, the grass that needs cutting, Sudoku, Twitter, playing guitar, naps, basically anything. I just thought that was hilarious. I hear that a lot from writers, that it's a discipline like anything else. But I really enjoyed the way you described it. I felt like I was right there with you. And your last sentence is, the hardest book to write is always the next one. So it sounds like you're on your next one on number 5, right? I
am trying. About 20,000 words in.
I was going to say, how many words in are you? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll definitely be looking forward to that. But let's talk a little bit about your Murder Squad series. I love legal novels. Lester does too. By the way, I was going to tell you, A Time to Kill. Lester really is Jake Brigance in the office. His office literally overlooks the square of Cartersville, and it's that old-timey office with the brick walls, and so that's how I picture Jake Brigance. So, but let me talk to you about your books, or let you talk to us about them. I just finished Hard Way to Die, about the Jekyll Island State Bar meeting and killing of a state bar president, and I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. Can't wait to read the rest of yours. Let's talk about where you got the idea of Murder Squad. Sounds pretty juicy. And you've got this leading actor, protagonist, Chance Meridian, which sounds dashing. So where do you get your ideas for the main characters and a plot and things like that?
Yeah. So the series was almost an afterthought, because I wrote the first book thinking it was going to be just its own standalone. But one of the things I learned about the business is people like series. That's kind of the way of the world now, unless you're already really established. And so I have the first book. Now it's going to be a series. So how do I go about that? And just for things based on the first book, and because his family was murdered, which goes into the first book, he doesn't want to be a criminal defense lawyer. The protagonist, Chance Meridian, but he's kind of over being a trial lawyer too after the first book, and so I had to kind of create a storyline to give him something to do outside those parameters. And the second book starts with him investigating as a special attorney general the murder of a Georgia Supreme Court justice. And at the end of that, that kind of builds on going the murder squad going forward. But that was something that arose organically, creating the first two books. That wasn't a destination at all. As for plots and how I come up with them, I mean, I don't even know. And that sounds like a cop-out. I mean, it's really difficult. And you never know what's going to, inspire you. But like with book two, the murder of a Georgia Supreme Court justice, at the opening of the new Georgia appellate courthouse. And so Georgia around this time opened a new courthouse. So I got, okay, that's a kind of an interesting thing. Supreme Court justice came down, Clarence Thomas came down. Okay, you can have someone from Washington coming down. And that kind of, just that real life event gave me the idea of I can build something around that. And it worked better when I killed the Chief Justice. I mean,
why not?
Why not? And then similarly, A Hard Way to Die, I've been to state bar meetings at Jekyll Island. And it was a way to get out of Atlanta too, because the first three books are in Atlanta. Felt like maybe needed a little scenery change. And that was a real life event. Just the conferences down there, which I've been to with my wife, is okay. I can build something around that, and then just try to, create a plot based on that setting.
So do you sit at these conferences, like the opening of the judicial building or the state bar meeting, and just sit and think about who should die in this meeting? How can I craft a good murder with these people?
Everyone's fictional, and that's the truth. I mean, before Death to the Chief, which was the one about the Georgia Supreme Court justice, because my wife, was on the Georgia Supreme Court, I had to have a very strongly worded disclaimer.
Yeah,
that
I bet
all of this is fictional, and it really is. I mean, the real life stuff is the stuff like, okay, they opened the courthouse, I can build something right now. But the characters, the people, I mean, most people I know aren't that interesting. I mean, you have to really create, unreal characters in fiction to make it like something somebody wants to read. And so it wasn't based on any real state bar president either.
Not even in a seersucker suit.
No, is there someone like that? I hope not. Because I was making it up, and I'm like, I try to describe someone I didn't know, and I hope I didn't accidentally stumble onto somebody.
Do you are you part of a writing group? I know a lot of authors write and then they share their drafts with each other and get feedback, or do you use focus groups or reviews? I mean, how do you gauge how you're doing?
Yeah, no writing group or anything. I know some authors use that, and I've never had the opportunity. And so I have a deep suspicion of group work, throughout all my life, because I mean, really, it's writing so personal and individual. I mean, you have to just sit down like the press field and do the work. And if you start writing for the writing group, I mean, maybe it works for some people. So what I do, I write a first draft, then I edit. So that's 1.0. I edit the draft. That's 2.0. And then I take that version and I have a team that reads it. My high school English teacher, who huge influence on my life. She reads it. Two of my colleagues, John Marshall, read it, and then a lawyer friend I have down here in Peachtree City reads it, and they give me their feedback, and then I go and create version 4.0, and usually it's 5.0 is the one that actually gets published. Now the first one, my wife read it too, and that one had a much more edits. I mean, I took out 50,000 words.
Oh wow!
Part of not knowing what I was doing with the first book, yeah, and editing is where the big thing is just you got to get the first draft done and then edit, and be willing to edit and be willing to listen. I mean, one of the things I read Stephen King's book on writing, which is a great book if you're interested in being a writer. And one of the things he said was after you finish the draft, go back and edit at least 10% and cut it out. And when I first read that, I was like, oh, no way. I know how hard each page is. I'm not going to cut it out. I mean, that's nuts. But then once I started having a critical eye, on the first book, I can take this out and it doesn't change the story at all. I can take this out. Cut. In the writing community, there's a phrase that, murder your darlings. Like you have this great paragraph, but it didn't really go to the story. You can take it out and it doesn't change anything. You're like, well, I really like the paragraph. Well, if it doesn't serve the story, you got to take it out. And that's part of the maturation, the learning process that I've been going through.
So I want to, so I'm not a total slackard in preparing for podcasts. Robin sent me your law review article defending Atticus Finch. Actually, I think it was the reply brief, for lack of a better term, that defended him against the utter heresy that Malcolm Gladwell published in the New Yorker, I think, a few years ago. And I was so taken by it, because I'd read Gladwell's attack on Atticus Finch, and you wrote the brief in defense of him that I wish I could have written, or had written. And so I can tell, that we have a lot in common here. So my question to you is To Kill a Mockingbird the ultimate legal thriller?
I think it has to be, just for its impact on society. I think law professors write all these law review articles, which serve important purposes and such. And I've written a bunch. But that book had more of an impact than the movie too, than all the law review articles put together. And I think there's a reason for that. And one of the things I'm trying a little bit to do with my work is that stories are powerful teaching tools. In a way that academic scholarship are not. You think if you go back to Jesus, all his stories are parables. That's how he taught, was through parables, because that's people learn through that kind of teaching in many ways. And To Kill a Mockingbird was the story that inspired so many of us ever since.
It inspired us so much, me and my husband, who's also a lawyer. We named our daughter Harper, as her middle name, Alex Harper, after Harper Lee, and we just felt like that was something we needed to do to honor Harper Lee. I think a lot of trial lawyers view Atticus Finch as the ultimate trial lawyer. And I will try to, if it's all right with you, Lance, put your law review article about Atticus Finch on our website. I read it and I loved it as well. And at the very first paragraph, you say your conclusion about Atticus Finch. You say, I conclude that Finch is a New Testament style prophet whose worldwide view propels him to this truth: love and understanding open doors, judgment and condemnation close them. And that's definitely a Christian outlook. And we also like to ask our guests, do you have any sort of religious tenets, or do you use your faith in your work? You obviously do. And so I'm interested in that, how it has shaped you, molded you, but transforms your work where you can use your faith to get a message across, just like you say Atticus Finch did.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I think about when I'm creating, my world, this world, is how can I be different? And one of the differences is, the narrator, Chance Meridian, is a Christian who, thinks about his faith, struggles with his faith. I mean, the first book is, huge struggles with his faith, because he's coming from a world where it happens before the book started, but his wife and son were murdered. And he has a lot of problems, with God, because of that. And, at the end of the book, part of his journey is kind of the spiritual recognition and reconciliation. Dealing with kind of the themes that you just read from my law review article, of kind of this embrace of grace, and realizing he can't solve all the problems of the world, and because he had that kind of identity as this prosecutor who's going to bring justice, to everyone who deserved it. And just as the way events unfold, he falls a little short. And so that's part of the story of the first book. And then the later books, not as much, but there are pockets of that where, his faith is still, important to him. And that's what I wanted, part of the story, to write about that. Cause I don't know that has gotten a lot of coverage in books of this sort. And so
I totally agree with that. Has not gotten much, and I'm glad you're willing to bring that aspect of people's lives out. And you point out in the article that Atticus is a hero because he sacrificed part of himself, including the willingness to risk his life to make a stand against racial injustice. That's a powerful statement. And, I don't know that I'm willing to risk my life in the practice of law, but I'd like to be able to say I stood up for something like against racial injustice, or I used the power of my law degree to do something like that.
Yeah, and the context is I'm responding to the Gladwell article, or Gladwell, really harsh on Atticus. And I was trying to explain some of the things, that from Atticus' point of view that Gladwell didn't really appreciate, but to that point, once you stand in front of an angry mob who has guns and you're unarmed, you get a pass with me.
I agree.
Because that's not easy to do.
One of the things too that I would ask you to sort of talk about is, I don't know that this is just my term for it, but that the Gladwell article had what I would call anachronistic morality. Anachronism being something that's out of time. Using an M16 in the Civil War, or whatever. And it seems to me, to Robin's point, about now, there are a lot of us lawyers in I'll say the post MLK era, where standing up against racism, is viewed as not really something that puts you in danger, but something that in most quarters, at least today, draws you praise and adulation. And I mean, from my point of view, that's one of the things the Gladwell piece really sort of missed, was that standing up was physically endangering, not even just getting you ostracized from impolite society, maybe. And you spoke much more eloquently to that than I ever could in your article, and I wish you would talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the things that Gladwell seemed to want him to do, Atticus to do, in the context of 1930s Alabama, were futile. And so it was this kind of modernist, hey, what about this? Looking back, and again, he diminished in the stuff he did do, and the fact that he was, trying to use a evangelical type Christian, not overtly, but the kind of mindset of turning the other cheek, loving the neighbor even when they're wrong, as a way to have influence to change things, for the good, as opposed to coming in with an M16 and just killing all the townspeople. I mean, so yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, it was a very kind of hindsight, bias look that missed the point that this book, whatever you think, clearly advanced the cause. I mean, just factually, you can't really debate, that it made things better. And it came out at a time, especially with the movie, it came out at the right time. That's part of its influence. The early 60s with the Freedom Riders, traveling through the South, and television really for the first time broadcasting to the rest of the nation what's happening. The book came out at the right time, and it served as an indictment on the conscience of the country. And just to kind of 40 years later to sweep that all away, I mean, that's what motivated me to write the counter in the first place.
Did you? I don't know if you read the book "Furious Hours" by Casey Sepp, which was it was about Harper Lee and the novel, not the novel, but the true crime case that she sort of worked on but never wrote the book about. But Harper Lee, and you were talking about earlier, the hardest novel to write is the next one, and she wrote one, and that it won a Pulitzer Prize, and never wrote another one. As a lawyer and a novelist, any theories about why that was? Do you think it was just too hard to go back, or what's your assessment of that?
I mean, it is curious. I don't know why. I mean, because it's almost an impossible, book to top. Like I said, right book, right time, right actor playing in the movie. I mean, it's kind of a perfect storm. And, I'm sure it made her tons of money too. So, to set her off for the rest of her life. I think she got a lot of pushback maybe on the ground in town. I don't know if the social aspect affected it. It's really hard to say. But I mean, J.D. Salinger, the same thing, wrote a book, Catcher in the Rye around that same time. Never, did another one. But part of it is hard. I mean, it's hard. It's hard work. That I didn't appreciate it probably as much until I did it. I mean, it's not easy, and there is some self-hatred involved as you do it, because the first drafts aren't good, and it's a struggle. And I mean, you got to will yourself to keep on going.
Well, To Kill a Mockingbird obviously had one of the greatest trial scenes ever written. In your last book, Hard Way to Die, it does not have a trial scene. Do you not have any requirement that there must be a fantastic trial scene in every one of your books?
I do not. And this is part of, I mean, what I'm most proud about the first book, besides just getting it done, is I think the trial scenes are pretty good. Now, the rest of the book, maybe not as much, but I really like the trial scene. I know how much work I put into that. But the next three books don't have, that same courtroom dynamic. And part of it goes back to the series, that because he's not going to be a defense lawyer for the reasons, because I painted myself in that corner in the first book, because I thought it was just going to be one book, and he's like, he's never going to defend murderers just because of what happened to his family. And just from a practical perspective, writing legal thrillers from the prosecutor's perspective is really difficult. If you think about most legal thrillers, they're usually from the defense side, because you can get off the innocent client. Right. Whereas you're prosecuting someone, and you're the narrator, you're the protagonist, the slash hero, whatever. I mean, if you don't get the right guy, then you're kind of a dope. But I do want to get him back in the courtroom. But I just hadn't figured out yet how to do it in a way that doesn't make him a dope at the end, necessarily. Because he was very good at that. And that's his reputation. But it's really hard to write legal thrillers from a prosecutor's perspective. You don't see many of them because of that. And that's kind of the practical roadblock I'm butting my head up against.
That's interesting to me, because, you don't see a lot of British legal thrillers because they have a split practice. So the barrister who goes to court is never out sort of investigating, the case. And I think in a lot of ways, the legal thriller is sort of a uniquely American invention.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with Giroux and then Grisham took it on steroids. I mean, they basically created the category. I mean, they had some early. I mean, Witness for the Prosecution, the famous English one, but few and far between. It is this a relatively recent American type genre. Thank goodness for it too.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're lawyers. We're all lawyers, so we love to read legal fiction, legal thrillers. But so many non-lawyers love to read it too. It's an incredible genre, very popular. Lance, let me ask you this: other than your own books, do you have a favorite book?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. And my favorite book's actually, it's not a legal threat. I think it's The Prince of Tides by Pat.
Wow. That's my favorite book too.
We love that book.
I've read it a number of times. I read it that freshman year. I did a lot of reading my freshman year of college. It just took me to, I mean, it's just amazing. It's the funniest book I've ever read, the most moving book I've ever read. I mean, just great choice. I when I was in law school at Emory, I clerked for a law firm in Charleston, South Carolina, both summers, and I felt a duty to read Pat Conroy because of that. So I read Prince of Tides, and then I read every book he's ever written and just fell in love with him. So I definitely see that as a smart choice.
One of the great scenes in Prince of Tides for purposes of Robin going to the football game today is the story of the Clemson Carolina game in there when he runs the punt and the kickoff back, but the description of football, I saw it was later published in Southern Living just as an article, sort of by its standalone piece, because it was so beautifully written, such a beautifully written story about a football game.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, it's amazing.
And Lance, we know you're on your next book. That'll be number 5. You talked a little bit about To Kill a Mockingbird becoming a movie. Any chance that one of the Murder Squad series is going to be made into a movie? Will you be in your name in lights?
Hey, I'm open to it. You're in LA, so you can give me a deal.
If I could, I would for you. Don't worry.
Yeah,
I'd love to see that happen.
Me too. I mean, my family, we have discussions as to who we should think play
exactly
various characters. So that's kind of fun. But I don't know how to go about that. I would, but yeah, that would be wonderful.
We just got a new TV show about a GBI, agent. So maybe Georgia is the new LA for the coming decade. So
yeah, that's based on the Karen Slaughter's work, Will Trent. So
yeah. Well, Lance, we've been talking with you for a while now, and we appreciate your time. But as I told you, we ask every guest as our final question, how do you define justice, or what is justice to you?
Yes. So before the third book, To Kill a Lawyer, I have a quote. And some of the books have quotes before them and some don't. So this quote is from the character Lou Archer, who's the protagonist detective in Ross McDonald's series. The Lou Archer series, which I think is probably the best detective series, top to bottom. And he has this quote that I used before the book. I have a secret passion for mercy, but justice is what keeps happening to people. And I was thinking about that quote in the context of what is justice. And I think justice is, getting what we deserve.
Yes.
In the fiction world, that's an easy thing to do because we create the world, and the fiction world has a level of omniscience about it that allows us, the author, to make the reader know, hey, here's the full truth. And so we know everything about, the villain, and this is how we're going to give them justice. And so you have like a Jack Reacher character, who I love the Jack Reacher books, who breaks all kinds of laws and immediately knows the contours of a situation just about, and delivers, rough justice. And we as the reader, cheer that on. But, human institutions are not, that infallible. And so, big picture justice is getting what we deserve, but we put on the law hat, it becomes a harder thing to get to. And that's where process becomes more important than the substantive outcome of seeing that someone gets what they deserve. Because we create these processes to deal with a very fallen type world. Criminal justice system has, you have the police actors, you have the jury actors, the judge actors, the prosecutor actors, and there's so many ways things can go wrong, intentionally and unintentionally. And so one of the things I try to explore this theme, not explicitly, but implicitly in the first book, The Murder of Sarah Barton, is that you have this prosecutor convinced of, the rightness of his ways in seeking justice, making sure someone gets what they deserve. They starts bending rules. And, a lot of times when we learn about prosecutor misconduct, like, how can they do that? I mean, but they've bought into some narrative that there's a bigger picture of making sure the defendant gets what, he or she deserves, and lose sight of, this isn't a novel. That we have to have very real procedures in place, or we're going to have, innocent people in death row, or innocent people, executed. And that's the rub. And part of Chance Meridian's journey is this realization that, sometimes justice isn't going to happen in this world, and you got to turn over some of it to God. The first book doesn't resolve who killed his wife and son. And then none of the books so far resolve that. And part of when I wrote the first book was I wasn't going to resolve it because that's how life is. It's messy. Now, having written the series long enough, people want to know what happened. And so at some point I'm going to have to, when I figure it out, explain what actually happened. Because that's what, there's a consumer component to it as well. But in real life, sometimes you got to let it go. And that's hard. It's hard to turn things over to God and let the cosmic justice of people getting what they deserve work itself out in a way that you may never know about. And breaking the rules to get there works well in fiction, but not so well in the real world. So.
Karma, I believe in karma.
What you sow.
And you may not always be around to see it happen, but
yeah.
I'm thinking about Willie Nelson, and justice is the one thing you can always find, but you got to saddle up your horses and take a hard ride. That's true. I'm not sure you always find it even then, but
yeah,
it's elusive.
Yeah.
Well, Lance, thank you so much. It's been wonderful spending the last hour with you talking about your books. Just to remind our listeners, we've been talking with law professor and author Lance McMillian, and you can get his books on Amazon.com in Kindle, paperback, or hardback. I guess pretty much wherever you can get a book, his books are there. You can learn more. Follow Lance at facebook.com/LanceBooks. And you can learn more about Lance and follow him on Twitter at Lance McMillian. And so I encourage our listeners to grab one of his books and enjoy it in front of a fire with a bourbon. That's the way I read. And you'll have a wonderful evening. So, Lance, thank you so much for your time. We've really enjoyed being with you.
Well, yes. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right. So now for our longtime listeners, this is where Lester and I want to bring up a legal related news item that's current in the news that just kind of catches our eye for whatever reason. Maybe it's a story of justice. Maybe it's one of injustice. Maybe it's something against the law profession that we don't like, whatever it is. But we found a couple of items that we wanted to share with our listeners. And Lester, why don't you go first?
I will. My article today is on the website Above the Law, which I think a lot of our lawyer listeners are familiar with. It was published today, and it's entitled "Trump Attorney That's About to Take Over as a Law School Dean Gets Some Curious Support." And it talks about High Point University, which is a private United Methodist Church affiliated law school in North Carolina, and they have selected Mark Martin as their new dean. He was Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, was on the Court of Appeals, taught at Regent University, and he's been named the dean. But he was also one of the ones who came up with this, in my view, sort of cockamamie theory that Vice President Pence could nullify the election and somehow proclaim Donald Trump to be president of the United States. And but this article goes on to talk about that he gets support from an unusual source. And that unusual source is Erwin Chemerinsky, who you and I think, heard out in Hawaii at the International Society of Barristers, who's the dean at the University of California, Cal Berkeley, law school.
Right.
And so he, while at the same time criticizing the position that was taken, Chemerinsky says this: "It's crucial that what occurred after the 2020 election, including the events of January 6th, not be recast as politics as usual. It was the first attempted coup in American history. It was the first attempted insurrection. The House hearings have thoroughly documented that Trump was its architect and it must be held responsible. I never believed, I would say, but the very survival of American democracy is in danger. The Trump presidency and events of after the November 20th election all reveal the fragility of American democracy. And so you've got Kermensky, who's saying all these things about this legal theory, but he says about Mark Martin. Mark Martin is the ideal person to be the founding dean of the new law school at High Point University. His experience as a lawyer, as Chief Justice, North Carolina Supreme Court, and as a law school dean all make him superbly qualified to lead this new law school with him at the helm. They are already far on the way to creating an outstanding law school. So this is interesting to me for a couple of reasons. The first thing is, I think you and I both, Robin, don't believe in what, at least as far as trial lawyers go, guilt by client. Just because you've represented somebody that's been accused of a heinous crime, we take the cause of our client. That's our job, to do that. And
right. John Adams represented the members of the Boston Massacre. So
yes, and began his argument by saying, if I can but be the instrument of preserving one life, his blessings and tears of transport are sufficient for the contempt of all mankind.
Wow.
So
wow. Awesome.
I'm not critical of Martin for representing President Trump or whatever else, but to me, it's sort of a different thing when you're talking about legal theories that are really bizarre, that cannot really be supported by scholarship. I would note that Kermensky also has on staff there the guy who wrote the terrorism is okay memo, back there. The waterboarding is okay memo. Torture is okay. I said terrorism. I meant
yeah, torture. Yeah, I gotcha.
But I guess I throw this out there for our listeners because I do believe, as Shakespeare said, strive mightily as those in the law do, but eat and drink as friends. On the other hand, there's something that leaves a little distaste about that meal when I see folks that are sort of openly corrupting the law by advocating legal theories that are really not supported anywhere in case law, statutory law, or legal treatises whatsoever. And I think that's what that was. So it's just food for thought.
It is concerning. I mean, if it were a scientist writing an issue in a scientific journal and he was just flat making stuff up, he would be called out and probably never write another article, certainly not be the dean of the chemistry wing or whatever. But Chermensky, it's also interesting because Dean Chermensky, incredible legal mind, but everyone knows him to be very, very liberal. He's from a very, very liberal law school at Berkeley. I want to say that when we heard him speak out in Hawaii, he predicted the next 5 rulings of the United States Supreme Court, and he was spot on with every single one of them. I sat there and he would say, this is how they're going to rule. And my mouth would drop. I'm like, oh, please tell me no. And then this past year, that's exactly what happened. So the guy is smart. There's no question about that. Great legal scholar. But yeah, that's very interesting because he's so liberal. So neat point. My article that I spotted in the news happened just last month, and the headline is "Lawyer Who Missed Deadline After Spending 25 Minutes Trying to File an ECF, Electronically Filed Document, Gets No Mercy from the 10th Circuit." And this is about a lawyer in Denver who he says, I barely missed the deadline. He got on, for our listeners who aren't lawyers, everything is filed electronically now. So you don't have a clerk go in person to the clerk's office and file something in person. You file everything by electronic filing. This is a lawyer in Denver who on the 60th day, at a 60-day deadline to file this, on the 60th night at 11:40 p.m., attempted to file something electronically. Didn't know what he was doing and didn't get it filed until 12:16 a.m., 16 minutes too late. And the court said, too bad, we're not accepting your filing. You didn't file it correctly. He went all the way to the 10th Circuit appealing that. And the 10th Circuit said, sorry, buddy, there was nothing wrong with our system. The problem was user error. You didn't know what you were doing. And you've now committed malpractice for your client because you didn't get this it was an objection to a bankruptcy. You didn't get it filed on behalf of your client, which was a bank in Denver. So it says during this time that he was on the electronic filing system, he left the system for 11 minutes to email the complaint and exhibits to opposing counsel. I guess thinking, well, at least I can get them to opposing counsel. Maybe that will get me off the hook. But the 10th Circuit showed no mercy on him and didn't reverse. My point about this is, folks, if your lawyer is getting on an electronic filing system and trying to file a pleading on the 60th day of your 60-day deadline at 11:40 p.m., you need a new lawyer. That is, I would go with the 10th Circuit. I think that's inexcusable. And I really don't know why this guy is representing people, because that's not the way you practice law.
It's interesting. I think if you divided people into the camps that think that was too harsh and the ones that think it's okay, the ones who think it's too harsh are probably people that say, well, all this technology, what all could go wrong with that? Which I appreciate. I'm a bit of a troglodyte, myself when it comes to technology. But on the other hand, if it was the old days when the courthouse closes at 5:00,
right?
And you got there, whether it was because of a traffic jam, tractor trailer, you get behind a logging truck. If you live out here in the hinterlands with me, when you get there 16 minutes late, the courthouse is locked and the clerks have gone home. Even though you sort of gave it your best efforts, you got there too late. So I think that's probably a recognition that we now have to be sufficiently versed in technology that we're not gonna have the courthouse door virtually slammed in our face.
Absolutely. I think that is part of our duties. I do remember back in early on in my career when I was a defense attorney, and we would send a clerk to the court to file something. They would stand in line, and it closed at 4:15 back then. And you would just be on pins and needles until that courier called you and said, okay, I got it filed. And you're like, shoo.
Well, and the other thing too, in fairness now, and fortunately, I've got some very skilled people in my office that help me file these things.
Yes.
But, one of the interesting things is now a lot of these Georgia state court filing systems, you file it, but, when you were talking about the clerk going down, send a runner down, to file this thing, they brought you back the file stamp copy. And that was the gold standard. I mean, if any judge said you filed this late, you could hold it up in court and say, here's the stamp, tells the time about that. But, a lot of these things that we file electronically now, it doesn't get marked received until 3 days later.
Right. You get an accepted email and then you're like, gosh. Yeah. So we don't wait until the last day, but you do have great help. And I know you don't ever have to worry about that. I have great help with Nikki Wilson. I don't have to ever worry about getting something filed on time. Thank goodness. So anyway, I just thought it was very, very interesting.
That gives me an idea. We ought to talk about, I've got Robin Pulliam and Dee Dee Toole, who've been with me for 26 and 27 years. We ought to get all our legal assistants on a podcast one day about what it's like being a non-lawyer working for a lawyer. I think they have great insight into what we do that we're probably blinded to a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to hear what Nikki says about me, but she's been with me 25 years through thick and thin. So yeah, she knows as much as I do. That's for sure. Well, Lester, it's been a great time. I loved talking with Lance McMillian, and just want to remind our listeners that we want to thank our sponsor, the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation. You may learn more about the foundation at fairplay.org. Fred Smith is our executive director of the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation. And we also want to thank our producer, Philip Hoover, and we thank our listeners. You can learn more about our host, Lester Tate, at aikentate.com. And you can learn more about me, Robin Fraser Clark, at gatriallawyers.net. You can learn more about our podcast, See You in Court, at seeyouincourt.squarespace.com. We hope you subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends and family. You can find See You in Court on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and anywhere where you get your podcast. And we ask that you rate the podcast. If you want to send us any questions or make a suggestion about an interesting legal topic, email us at seeyouincourtpodcast@gmail.com. So thanks again, Lester. Great spending the morning with you. And from Los Angeles, go Dogs.
Good luck to the Dogs tonight.
Yeah. I hope it turns out well. And until next time, we'll see you in court.
Thank you for listening to See You in Court, brought to you by the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation and the Georgia Institute of Technology. Please subscribe to this podcast and consider writing a review. You may find related documents to this week's episode on our website, seeyouincourt.podbean.com. Please send any questions, suggestions, or ideas to seeyouincourtpodcast@gmail.com. We thank Noreen Hassan, Associate Professor and Director of Outreach and Community Engagement at the Georgia Institute of Technology School of Literature, Media, and Communication, and the Georgia Tech students who help bring you this podcast. I'm Fred Smith, Executive Director of the Georgia Civil Justice Foundation. You may learn